Welcome to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're taking a look at James Varney's latest investigation, where he looks into why the New York Attorney General is targeting a castle in West Virginia and the larger story surrounding it. Peter Brimelow, a supporter of strong restrictions on immigration, and his nonprofit VDARE have come under fire. The nonprofit has been labeled by organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center as promoting white supremacist ideology. New York Attorney General Letitia James found issue with the nonprofit. She alleges financial improprieties connected to a West Virginia castle, a castle that was said to be bought to host VDARE events and generate revenue for the organization. Due to the back and forth with the AG and the costly legal fees in this case, the nonprofit has suspended its work. James alleges the Brimelows used the nonprofit to enrich themselves, including with the purchase of the Berkeley Springs Castle for about $1.4 million. The lawsuit alleges that they had a lease rent-back scheme and that the nonprofit was basically paying for a place for them to live. It also alleges other improper transactions. The Brimelows say that this is lawfare, that allegations are baseless, and that James created a case to mask her true purpose, which was to silence political voices that she disagrees with. James herself is also under federal indictment brought by the Trump administration over alleged mortgage fraud connected to homes she bought outside of New York. The Brimelows ask why James is concerned over the nonprofit when the state of West Virginia and the IRS have not raised the same concerns. Is this about the castle or social justice? We're joined now by the lead investigator on this story, Jim Varney. Jim, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
So I've had many conversations with Real Clear investigators about lawfare in the past and the increase that we've been seeing, especially during the second Trump term. Is this an example of that?
Well, it seems to be. And I would say, you mentioned during the second Trump term, I think it really happened during Biden's term, and that this is sort of a continuation of it. But the case that we're talking about here in the story involves the New York Attorney General Letitia James, who, of course, was at the center of a lot of this lawfare that was going on in New York State against Trump last year. She's the one that brought the case, very odd case, because there was no injured party in a real estate deal between quite sophisticated real estate bankers and developers, Trump and I think Citicorp maybe and some others. There he supposedly had misrepresented himself, and of course they got a conviction with a judge who certainly didn't appear to be all that impartial. So this is a continuation of that in the sense that it is the same player, principal player, Letitia James, who's involved in it.
So for those who might not be familiar with how all of this would work, how does Letitia James have the power to go after this nonprofit and scrutinize their actions in a state far from her own jurisdiction of New York State?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, this nonprofit, VDARE, was incorporated in New York State. And according to them, the VDARE people, you can't dissolve or end your nonprofit there in New York without the AG's permission. But in any event, I believe that many state attorneys general do have the authority to look into nonprofits and charitable groups that are operating within the state if they think there's something untoward going on. So I don't think that James is necessarily overstepping her bounds in terms of what her office is allowed to do or permitted to do. It just seems like this is sort of an odd case for them to bring it all. But certainly attorneys general do generally have the power to subpoena and investigate both nonprofit and profit corporations that they think are probably up to something that is financially illegal.
So it did seem like within your piece that the Brimelows had a response to the different aspects of the lawsuit that was put forth against them by James. What are your key takeaways from this entire situation? And as well, it's important to maybe note who the AG has on her team going after this case, because there does seem to be a social justice element underneath it.
That's right. Yeah. And so I guess we sort of need to define the term as well, right? So lawfare, what we mean by that is bringing the power of the state, generally speaking, prosecutorial power, against individuals or companies or something because you disagree with them politically, and essentially going on a fishing expedition to find something. The famous quote from Stalin is, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." So it's that kind of mentality here. So the Brimelows are alleging that the New York Attorney General launched this investigation against them in 2022 on, we don't really know exactly why, because as we said with the Trump case, there doesn't appear to have been an injured party here. None of the people that have given money to VDARE were complaining about it. And they didn't do anything in terms of filing charges until last month. So for parts of 2022, all of 23, all of 24, they're just investigating them, hitting them with subpoenas, trying to get them all these legal series of meetings and hearings and things like this that become incredibly expensive. Anybody knows your legal bills can mount pretty quickly. And so that's what has happened here. And I think that the idea that James's office was led by, as you mentioned in this case, a guy named Rick Sawyer, who in 2022, the same year that the investigation began, spoke to the Anti-Defamation League and talked about how, as prosecutors, we've got this power to go in and start subpoenaing people. We have massive power. We can do massive discovery. We can essentially tie these people up in court and find out all this information about them before we ever bring any charges. And that's exactly the playbook that they seem to have followed here. So the timing of all of that and the length of time that was involved is something that makes it very suspicious.
Especially since VDARE has ceased operations. They do claim that the legal fees just were too much and they're unable to continue in this state. I did want to ask, how do we manage this intersection of charity regulation and free speech ideology? How are we making sure that, yes, we need to make sure that charities are acting within regulations and acting properly, while also not just going after them because we might not agree.
Mm-hmm. Well, we actually had that concern. I mentioned this to you about VDARE. I was not familiar with VDARE, and many of the people that I mentioned in this piece, I'd never heard of. Peter Brimelow I had heard of because he used to write in National Review 25 years ago or something, and had written a book, but I haven't read, but I knew about. So, but these other people, I don't know who they are. To this day, I've never read them. So we wanted to make sure before we wrote this that we weren't trying to, so to speak, champion someone who was sort of beyond the pale, right? And they are edgy. There is stuff there that they were publishing that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it's clearly protected by the First Amendment. There doesn't seem to be any question about that. And I think that you have to ask yourself, when you wonder what the prosecutors are going to choose to look at, why are they choosing to look at this? What is it that they allege happened? You've got some charities that are far bigger than VDARE that maybe have got some dubious things going on. You, from time to time, will hear people complain about how much executives at these nonprofit places are being paid. And I'm not going to single any nonprofits out, right? But there are charitable organizations that are massive. There are charitable organizations that maybe are a little shadowy. Certainly VDARE wasn't well publicized, but it's not a big player. So I think you have to ask yourself, what targets is the Attorney General picking to go after here? And then you can start asking why and look at what's been going on at the target.
So this is obviously one case. Obviously, I mean, your headline brought me in wondering what the New York State Attorney General is doing, looking at a castle many, many miles from New York State. But what should we be looking at past this case? What is the broader picture that we need to be keeping in mind?
Well, I think that goes to the whole lawfare thing that you mentioned and we talked about at the very beginning, right? Letitia James is herself under indictment for alleged mortgage fraud. Now, many people see that as payback by the Trump administration for what she did to Trump. It may well be. That doesn't mean that something wasn't wrong or illegal. it looks as if mortgage fraud is surprisingly widespread among our elites, right? I mean, we've also seen the same allegations raised against Adam Schiff. And I think Cook, the Federal Reserve officer that Trump was trying to remove. So this looks like it's something that has been a pretty slippery area of the law for a lot of people for a long time. But is it something that we're going to, you remember the old expression, like, do you make a federal case out of it? Well, I think you got to ask yourself about the scale of what's happening here. And we were talking about that a moment ago with the nonprofits, right? Like, how big is it? How bad is what they're doing? And should this be something that we're spending our time and our money on? Now, the ball's already been set in motion, right? The things that happened last year, not just with Letitia James, but also with Alvin Bragg and also with Merrick Garland at the Justice Department. And we know the FBI, there's lately been allegations raised by a Senate committee that they were tapping into senators' phones and spying on Republican senators' phones. I think Arctic Frost was the name of this thing. So this pattern of prosecutors looking at their political opponents is something that has really stepped up in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think we need to look at the whole thing, and somebody hopefully will say, this has to end. This has to stop. I haven't seen, I don't know if you have, I haven't seen anybody saying that yet. Like, nobody that I know of on the Democratic side has come out and said, look, what we did was wrong. This shouldn't happen. We need to put an end to this and not do any of this going forward. And we pledge we're not going to do it. And then the other side, Trump needs to do the same. Because I think that this can be really destructive the longer it goes on and the deeper it gets.
It definitely seems that way. James, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I hope people look at the story and draw their own conclusions. As I said, this wasn't something that we were looking at because of the specific person that was doing it, right? It was the case itself, which does seem to have some very serious free speech implications, and the fact that Letitia James is already a major player in the lawfare that's been sort of going through the country in the last half decade or more.
Definitely. Well, it was a fantastic investigation. I'll encourage everyone to go read it in its entirety. Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.